Before we begin, I need to ask you something. Stories like this are not easy to tell, and they are even harder to hear. If you feel the weight of these forgotten voices, if you believe these hidden histories deserve to be uncovered, then subscribe to this channel. It costs nothing, but it keeps these buried truths from fading back into silence. Beneath the surface of every family tree lies a darkness we were never meant to uncover. Some roots run tangled, curling inward, feeding on themselves until the line is no longer strong but broken, cursed. Tonight, I want you to imagine a man so desperate to keep his bloodline pure that he turned to the unthinkable. His wife was not a stranger, not a neighbor, not even a distant cousin. She was his niece. And what began as a secret marriage within a single household would spiral into one of the most disturbing legacies of inbreeding the world has ever known. This isn't folklore. This isn't exaggeration. This is history. The kind of history whispered about behind closed doors, tucked away in family Bibles, erased from the official record, yet never fully buried. The union was paraded as if it were holy, a joining of kin, when in truth it was a fracture that could never heal. Families turned their heads, neighbors kept their silence, and the church bells rang as if it were any other wedding. But it was not. This was a covenant of blood, stitched together with shame, silence, and superstition. Imagine the whispers as the bride stood beside her uncle, who was also her husband. Some called it a blessing, others dared to call it a curse, and yet, in the name of family, in the name of keeping what was theirs, they bound themselves together. The result was not just a marriage, but a warning carved into flesh and bone. Children born into that union carried more than the family name. They carried the evidence, twisted features, weakened bodies, and haunted eyes that never escaped the shadow of their parents' sin. This wasn't love. This wasn't destiny. This was control. And once it began, it was almost impossible to stop. Because every child born in that house became both heir and victim, caught in a cycle of inheritance and decay. And the strangest part, this story did not unfold in some forgotten castle in Europe or in the backwoods of Appalachia. It happened here, closer to home than you want to believe. It happened in a world much like ours, among people who looked like anyone else, except for the truth they tried so hard to hide. Tonight, we open the ledger they hoped would stay closed forever. We turn the pages they prayed no one would read, and once you see what's inside, you will understand why this marriage has been called the most inbred in history. The man at the center of this story was not born a monster. He was born into a family already bent under the weight of its own blood. His father had married within the family, and his grandfather had done the same before him. To them, the family name was sacred, something to be preserved at all costs, even if that cost was humanity itself. Every generation, the pool grew smaller, the blood more concentrated, until there were no outsiders left to marry. The only faces at the dinner table were the same ones staring back in the mirror. As a boy, he was taught that outsiders could not be trusted, that the world beyond the family's land was filled with corruption and danger. They whispered to him that keeping the bloodline pure was not just tradition, but destiny. By the time he reached manhood, he didn't question it, he embraced it. And when his eyes fell upon his niece, barely grown, he saw not innocence, not kinship, but obligation. To him, she was chosen. To her, he was family. And in that imbalance of power, the marriage was sealed long before the vows were spoken. The wedding was a hushed affair, but not secret. Everyone in the family knew, and none spoke against it. Silence, after all, was survival. The church they wed in was small, its wooden beams cracked and weary, as though even the building itself groaned at the weight of the union. Some neighbors attended, uneasy in their pews, eyes fixed on the floor, pretending not to see. But they saw. They all saw. And when the rings were exchanged, when the kiss was pressed to lips that should have been untouchable, a line was crossed that could never be retraced. The bride, little more than a girl, did not resist. How could she? Raised under the same teachings, smothered by the same doctrines, she was told this was her duty, that love meant loyalty, even if loyalty meant betrayal of the natural order. Her silence was no at consent. It was captivity. And so the family celebrated, lifting glasses, feasting in the dim candlelight, while beneath the surface, something darker was binding itself to them all. This marriage was not an accident. It was a continuation of a cycle, the tightening of a noose woven through generations. What should have been a union of hope became the sealing of a curse, and the curse would not wait long to show itself. It began with the children. At first the family pretended all was well. The firstborn came into the world frail but alive, and they called it a blessing. Yet even in that moment of celebration, the midwife noticed the child's jawline, the way the eyes did not focus quite right, the tremor in the tiny hands. She said nothing, for who could dare speak against this family? But whispers do not stay buried. The neighbors heard, the community saw. And when the second child arrived, the truth could no longer be denied. The births became a spectacle of dread. Each child carried the proof of what had been done. The sloping foreheads, the crooked spines, the crossed eyes that stared in two directions at once. Some could not walk, some could not speak, some lived only a few days, their little bodies too weak to withstand the burden placed upon them. These children were not at fault. They were innocent, born into a legacy they had no power to escape. Yet they bore the punishment for sins that were never theirs to carry. Behind closed doors, the family tried to shield them from the world. Curtains drawn, shutters latched, the children grew in shadows, hidden away like secrets too grotesque to face. When strangers came, they were hushed into silence, locked in back rooms while the family smiled on the porch. But every so often, one of the children slipped into view, and the truth spilled out like a crack in the plaster. People began to whisper words that cut like knives. Cursed, deformed, unholy. The father, the uncle, the husband, he refused to hear it. To him, these children were not evidence of a curse, but proof of loyalty, a sacrifice to the family name. He told himself the outside world was envious, that their mockery was nothing but lies, yet even as he spoke, he could see it in their eyes. His children did not thrive, they withered, they suffered, and still he pressed on, pulling his wife, his niece, back into his arms, demanding more heirs, demanding more proof of his devotion to the bloodline. The house grew heavy with grief. Little graves dotted the earth behind it, each marked with a wooden cross, each smaller than the last. The wife's face aged before its time, etched with sorrow and silence. And in the still of night, when the wind rattled the shutters, the cries of children, those alive and those buried, echoed like a haunting reminder. This was no family legacy. This was a prison of their own making. By the time the neighbors could no longer ignore it, the family's name had already curdled into legend. Children in the nearby town whispered it as a warning. Don't go near their house, don't cross their fields, don't even say their name after dark. To the adults, it was less superstition than shame. They knew what was happening. They had watched it unfold across years of silence. But speaking against the family was dangerous. They held land, they held influence, and they held secrets no one dared expose. So the community chose cowardice. They turned away. But the truth does not vanish just because people refuse to look at it. The evidence was living, breathing, limping through the world. The surviving children were growing, their bodies twisted, their minds clouded, their faces marked by the unmistakable signs of kinship too close. When they appeared in public, people stared, some gasped, some even crossed themselves as though to ward off evil. The children, innocent of everything except the circumstances of their birth, became walking reminders of what happens when blood is forced to circle back on itself. The uncle-husband, proud and unrepentant, bristled at the stares. He began to isolate his family further, forbidding his wife and children from leaving the land without him. Their home became less a dwelling than a fortress, its doors barred, its windows shuttered. He convinced himself they were chosen, a line of purity misunderstood by outsiders. In truth, he was only sealing them deeper into decay. Every choice he made tightened the knot, pulling the family further from the world, further into their own suffocating cycle. And yet, there were moments when even he could not deny the horror. When another child failed to survive its first year, when another grave was dug in the family plot, the facade cracked. He wept, not in repentance, but in frustration, cursing God, cursing fate, cursing anyone but himself. His wife endured in silence, her body worn thin from bearing children who never stood a chance. To her, the marriage had become less about duty and more about survival. She obeyed because disobedience meant ruin. And so the cycle continued, each year pressing down harder than the last, until even the land seemed to wither beneath them. The story of their union spread beyond the town, whispered from county to county, twisted with each retelling. Some called it tragedy, some called it sin, but all agreed on one thing. Theirs was not just a marriage, it was a warning. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most, because by now you've stepped into a world that most would rather turn away from, a truth buried so deep in shame that even the descendants tried to erase it. But the ledger of blood does not forget, and neither do the scars it leaves behind. The family's legacy was written not just in twisted bodies and haunted eyes, but in the silence that followed them. Generations grew up under the shadow of that house, carrying a name that was both protection and curse. Some of the children lived to adulthood, but their lives were marked by isolation. Few married, and those who did often married within the same bloodline again, tightening the spiral further. Poverty gnawed at them, sickness followed them, and the deformities carried on like echoes of the original sin. By the time outsiders took notice, it was no longer just one marriage. It was an entire branch of humanity collapsing inward on itself. Historians would later argue whether it was desperation or madness that drove the family to cling so tightly to itself. Some believed it was about land, about keeping property locked within the same hands. Others thought it was superstition, the belief that bloodlines carried strength only when kept pure. But the truth is far simpler and far darker. It was control. A cycle of power passed down from one generation to the next, each uncle, each father, each patriarch forcing the next link in the chain to hold, no matter the cost. Imagine living under that roof, knowing the world beyond the fence line was full of other faces, other possibilities, and yet being told from birth that your destiny was already decided. Imagine watching your siblings, your cousins, your children grow twisted and broken and still being told this was holy, this was sacred, this was right. That is the prison of inbreeding. It is not just a curse of the body, it is a cage for the mind. Even now, long after the graves have sunken into the earth and the house itself has rotted into ruin, the whispers remain. Locals still tell of a family that lived too close to itself, a family that turned love into something monstrous. Their story lingers because it speaks to something we fear most. That family, the thing meant to protect us, can also destroy us when its walls grow too tight. There comes a point when a secret grows too heavy to keep, when the weight of silence becomes more dangerous than the truth itself. For this family, that breaking point came when outsiders began to dig, not out of curiosity, but necessity. Officials investigating sickness and poverty in the region stumbled upon what the community had long tried to hide. Records were examined, birth certificates cross-checked, and the tangled web of marriages revealed itself like a map of decay, uncle to niece, cousin to cousin, over and over again until the family tree was no longer a tree at all, but a knot of roots strangling each other in the dirt. What they found was not just shocking, it was damning. Generations of children born with defects so severe that survival itself was a miracle. Entire branches of the family line ending in infancy. Others who lived but never truly thrived, their bodies marked as living evidence of what had been done. The shame that the family had buried behind closed doors now lay bare in the light of documentation, undeniable, unerasable. The patriarch by then was old, his face worn by years of defiance and grief. He denied nothing, yet he confessed to nothing either. To him, there was no sin, only tradition. He insisted they were misunderstood, persecuted for their devotion, when in truth he had been the jailer of his own blood. His wife, his niece, sat silent as always, her eyes hollow, her body frail, the cost of her life etched into her skin. She had outlived many of her children, buried them with her own hands, and yet remained tethered to the man who had bound her to this fate. When the story reached wider ears, it became legend. Newspapers hinted at it, neighbors swore to it, and over time, historians whispered it into their archives. But no one wanted to claim it. It was too grotesque, too taboo, too close to the bone, and so the house was left to rot, the graves overtaken by weeds, the family name dissolving into whispers. But history has a way of surviving, even when those who lived it are gone. The photographs remain, faded, haunting, unblinking. The records remain, lines of ink mapping the collapse of bloodlines, and the land itself remains, silent, heavy, carrying the memory of a family that loved itself too much, and in doing so, destroyed itself. Even now, the story of the man who married his niece lingers like a ghost, not just because of what it says about him, but because of what it says about us. Families are supposed to be sanctuaries, the places where we are safest, where blood protects rather than poisons. But his legacy reminds us that the line between love and possession can blur, and when it does, what was meant to be holy becomes unspeakable. The photographs that survived tell more than words ever could. Children staring blankly into the camera, their features warped by generations of the same blood circling back on itself. Some smile faintly, unaware of how the world would judge them. Others look haunted, as if they already knew they were part of something they could never escape. Behind each face is a story of suffering, of innocence crushed under the weight of decisions made long before they were born. They were not monsters. They were victims, trapped in a cycle that began with a single vow spoken in the wrong church on the wrong day. When people today hear the story, they often ask how such a thing could have been allowed. How could an uncle take his niece as his bride? How could a family, a church, a community stand by and let it happen? The truth is chilling, because it was easier to stay silent than to confront, easier to look away than to admit that something holy had been corrupted, and so the silence became complicity, and complicity became legacy. The land where the house once stood is quiet now. The graves, weather-worn and nameless, sink deeper with each passing season. Travelers who pass through might not even notice. But if you stop long enough, if you listen when the wind cuts through the trees, you can feel it. A weight, a presence, a reminder that what happened there is not gone. It lingers not as a tale of love, but as a warning written in bone. This was not the store.